The English Channel was a maelstrom of steel grey, cold and violent motion. At 700 hours on June 6, 1944, the sea heaved in 5-foot swells, a sickening, rhythmic lurch that had turned the flat bottom of the landing craft tank, or LCT, into a vomit-slick torment for the men packed aboard. For Technician 5th Grade Waverly B. Woodson, Jr., a medic with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the misery was acute. 23 years old, he was a student of pre-med and biology, trained to understand the body's delicate mechanics. Now his own body, along with every other man in the United States First Army, was being subjected to a brutal, indifferent physics. Around him, the men of his unit, the only all-black combat unit slated to land on the beaches of Normandy that day, clutched their helmets and rifles, their faces a pale, greenish hue under the bruised dawn sky. Their specialized mission was defensive, to raise hydrogen-filled barrage balloons on long steel cables, creating an aerial fence to snag and destroy low-flying Luftwaffe fighters. But first, they had to cross this water and then cross a beach codenamed Omaha. The noise was a physical pressure, the drone of thousands of engines, the distant, percussive slam of naval guns from battleships like the USS Texas firing 14-inch shells over their heads, and the nearer, sharper crack of German artillery. Woodson's LCT, one of hundreds in the vast armada, churned toward the easy red sector of Omaha. The shoreline was a smudge of smoke and chaos, a place that had already, in the 90 minutes since H-hour, consumed the first waves of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. His craft was not an assault vessel, it was a follow-on element, bringing support troops and their equipment ashore. The plan assumed a secured beachhead. The plan was already a fantasy. At approximately 9:00 a.m., a geyser of water erupted just off their port side. Then another, closer. The incoming shells were from German 88 guns, firing with flat, lethal trajectories from fortified casemates on the bluffs. A direct hit tore through the LCT's unarmored hull. The explosion was a white flash and a wave of force. Metal screamed. Men screamed. The soldier standing next to Woodson was vaporized. A storm of hot shrapnel ripped through the craft, and Woodson felt a searing, unbelievable pain as jagged pieces of steel tore into his right buttock and inner thigh. He was grievously wounded before his feet ever touched French soil. In that moment of agony and chaos, adrift in a sinking vessel off a shore that was a slaughterhouse, his mission was irrevocably transformed. The story of Waverly Woodson on D-Day would not be about the barrage balloons he was meant to fly, but about the fundamental power of a single, unarmed man's will to mend what the machinery of war was built to destroy. Waverly Woodson was a product of a nation that demanded his service while denying him his full rights. Born in Philadelphia, he was an academically gifted young man who enrolled at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, one of the nation's oldest historically black colleges. There he studied medical technology, absorbing the precise, ordered world of biology and chemistry. When the war came, he enlisted, and his aptitude steered him toward the Army Medical Corps. Yet the Army he joined in 1942 was a rigidly segregated institution. It trained black soldiers in separate camps, housed them in separate barracks, and assigned them to separate units, almost always led by white officers. The prevailing military doctrine, steeped in racial prejudice, held that African Americans were unsuited for combat roles, questioning their intelligence, courage, and leadership potential. Consequently, the vast majority of the nearly 1 million black men who served in the U.S. Army during the war were relegated to service and supply roles: truck drivers, stevedores, engineers, quartermasters. They built the roads, unloaded the ships, and drove the fuel that powered the white combat arms. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was an anomaly. Designated as a combat unit, its role was technical and vital. The battalion was activated in 1942 at Camp Tyson, Tennessee, the nation's only barrage balloon training center. The men learned the complex art of handling the unwieldy, 86-foot-tall, silver-skinned balloons. Filled with highly flammable hydrogen gas, these lighter-than-air craft were tethered by steel cables designed to sever the wings of enemy aircraft flying below 5,000 feet. In an era before sophisticated surface-to-air missiles, they were a crucial defense against the kind of low-level strafing and dive-bombing attacks that could devastate a landing force and its supply dumps. The The 320th was a VLA unit, very low altitude, specifically trained for amphibious operations. After rigorous training in Tennessee, they shipped out to Great Britain in February 1944 to prepare for the invasion of Europe. There they drilled endlessly on the English coast, practicing the deployment of their awkward equipment under simulated combat conditions, all while enduring the daily slights and systemic discrimination of life in a Jim Crow army. The men of the 320th were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the German Reich and another against the prejudice that defined their own military. For Woodson, his medic's bag, filled with morphine syrettes, sulfur powder, and battle dressings, represented a purpose that transcended this bitter irony. His skill was not contingent on the color of his skin, and on Omaha Beach, that skill would soon be the only thing standing between life and death for hundreds of soldiers, both black and white. The ramp of the crippled LCT slammed down into the churning surf, and the world dissolved into a nightmare of sound and water. The beach was not a beach, it was a funnel of death. German machine guns, primarily the MG-42, with its terrifying rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute, swept the tidal flats from concrete bunkers known as Tobruk pits nestled in the bluffs. Mortar rounds walked across the sand, and artillery shells continued to rain down on the waves of incoming men. The tide was rising, shrinking the narrow strip of sand and forcing the survivors to press up against a steep bank of stones, the shingle, which offered the only meager cover. The water was choked with wrecked vehicles, floating debris, and the dead. Wounded men cried out from the surf, their blood staining the foam a pale pink. Woodson, bleeding heavily from his own wounds, half stumbled, half crawled from the landing craft into the chest-deep frigid water. He was a non-combatant. Under the Geneva Convention, medics were permitted to carry a pistol for self-defense, but like many, Woodson chose to be unarmed. His only weapon was his training. His only shield was the Red Cross crudely painted on his helmet and armband, a symbol the German gunners on Omaha Beach frequently ignored. He reached the relative safety of the shingle, a chaotic mass of bleeding, shocked, and dying soldiers. Most were from the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division and the 116th of the 29th. They were overwhelmingly white. In this maelstrom, the rigid segregation of the U.S. Army evaporated. There were no black soldiers or white soldiers. There were only the living, the wounded, and the dead. Woodson ignored the pain radiating from his leg and hip. He opened his medical bag and went to work. His movements were methodical, a stark contrast to the pandemonium around him. He found a small rock outcropping that provided a sliver of protection from the unceasing fire and established an impromptu aid station. He began triage, the brutal calculus of battlefield medicine, categorizing casualties, treating the most severe but salvageable first, and providing comfort to those who were beyond saving. He injected morphine to dull the agony of shattered limbs, sprinkled crystalline sulfur powder into gaping wounds to stave off infection, and applied pressure dressings to stanch the flow of life-giving blood. For men with sucking chest wounds, he improvised seals with cellophane from cigarette packs. The sheer scale of the carnage was overwhelming, yet he worked with a chilling, focused calm. Other men from the 320th, seeing his station, began carrying the wounded to him, turning his small patch of sand into a focal point of hope amidst the despair. The first critical turning point for Woodson was not a strategic decision, but a personal one. Wounded and under fire, he chose to become a healer rather than a casualty. He could have sought treatment for his own significant injuries, but instead, he turned his focus outward, his hands moving with a practiced efficiency that belied the horror of the scene. He administered blood plasma, a life-saving innovation of the war, drawing the precious fluid from glass bottles into the veins of men in shock from blood loss. The process was delicate and slow, requiring him to expose himself to fire for extended periods as he held the bottle aloft. He treated bullet wounds, deep shrapnel lacerations, and horrific blast injuries from Teller mines that had been buried in the sand. At one point, he found a soldier whose foot was mangled beyond repair, hanging by a thread of flesh and tissue. With the tide rising and no hope of immediate evacuation, Woodson made a grim decision. Using the only tools he had, he amputated the man's foot. This was the reality of his work, a desperate, intimate struggle waged one body at a time. While colonels and generals on ships offshore tried to make sense of the battle from maps and radio reports, Woodson was dealing with its tangible, bloody consequences. He pulled drowning men from the surf, risking his own life in the treacherous undertow. He resuscitated a soldier who had nearly suffocated after inhaling sand and seawater. His aid station, nothing more than a space between rocks, became one of the few places on Easy Red where the tide of death was being actively and effectively pushed back. His actions provided not just medical relief, but a powerful psychological anchor. In a landscape defined by randomness and violence, his calm, systematic work was an affirmation of order and humanity. He demonstrated that even in the heart of the inferno, a single, determined individual could impose a small measure of control, could literally piece the world back together, one suture, one bandage, one life at a time. The battle for Omaha Beach was a chaotic infantry fight, but for hundreds of men, their survival depended entirely on the unarmed black medic from the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. Years later, when asked about that day, Waverly Woodson's recollections were marked by a profound understatement that spoke volumes about the man. He did not speak of heroics or glory. He did not dwell on the terror or the pain of his own wounds. He spoke of his function, of the role he was trained to perform, as if the extraordinary circumstances were merely an extension of his duty. "I was a medic," he would state with simple finality, the words carrying the weight of the hundreds of lives that passed through his hands. This was not false modesty, it was the core of his identity in that moment. The chaos of Omaha Beach had stripped everything else away, rank, race, even his own physical well-being. What remained was the essential purpose he had been trained for at Lincoln University and by the Army Medical Corps. His statement was a testament to the power of a professional ethos in the face of annihilation. He was not a warrior in the traditional sense. He was a technician of the human body, a repairman working on the most complex machine of all, under the worst possible conditions. His work was a relentless cycle of triage and treatment. He stabilized one man only to see 3 more carried to his station. The sheer number of casualties on Omaha Beach was staggering, with American forces suffering over 2,400 killed, wounded, or missing on D-Day alone. The German 352nd Infantry Division, veterans of the Eastern Front, had been unexpectedly moved to the coast for training and put up a far more ferocious defense than Allied intelligence had anticipated. They used their interlocking fields of fire from machine gun nests and pre-sighted artillery to devastating effect. For the men on the beach, survival was often a matter of inches and seconds. For Woodson, it was a matter of minutes and priorities. A sucking chest wound took precedence over a broken arm. Arterial bleeding from a femoral artery had to be stopped in under 3 minutes, or the man would die. He had to make these life-or-death decisions dozens of times an hour, his mind a running calculator of injury severity, available supplies, and chances of survival. His simple declaration, "I was a medic," encapsulated this immense burden, a quiet acknowledgement of a responsibility that would have broken a lesser man. As the hours crawled by, the nature of the battle on the beach began to shift. The tide, which had been a deadly enemy, peaked and began to recede, exposing more of the beach and the German obstacles concealed within it. Small groups of American infantry, led by determined officers and NCOs, began to find weaknesses in the German defenses, blowing gaps in the barbed wire with Bangalore torpedoes and starting the slow, costly fight up the bluffs. But for Woodson, the battle remained the same. His aid station was now even more exposed on the wider beach, and his work only intensified as more wounded were brought down from the bluffs. His supplies were dwindling. He scavenged what he could from the medical kits of dead soldiers and medics, a grim but necessary task. His focus was absolute. He was operating in a state of heightened consciousness. The world narrowed to the wound in front of him, the next syringe of morphine, the next roll of gauze. His own condition was deteriorating. The shrapnel wounds in his thigh and buttock continued to bleed, and the pain was immense. He was losing blood, becoming dehydrated, and was operating on sheer adrenaline, yet he did not stop. For a period of 30 unbroken hours, from the morning of June 6th through the morning of June 7th, Waverly Woodson worked. He treated men from his own battalion, the 320th, who were now struggling to get their barrage balloons into the air amidst the continuing sniper and artillery fire. He treated infantrymen from the Big Red 1 and the 29th Division. He treated engineers and combat demolition units. He treated anyone who was brought to him, his hands, stained with the blood of dozens of men, never faltering. His actions were a powerful counter-narrative to the prejudice that defined his world. On Omaha Beach, his skill, not his skin color, was the only thing that mattered. The white soldiers he treated likely never knew his name, only that in their moment of greatest need, a black medic was the one who saved them. His relentless effort was a profound, unspoken refutation of the racist ideology he was fighting against, both from the enemy and from within his own army. A deep and painful irony shadowed Woodson's heroism. He was fighting and bleeding for a country that enforced segregation by law and by custom. The very freedoms he was helping to secure in Europe, freedom from tyranny, from racial persecution, were denied to him and millions of other African Americans at home. On the ships that carried them to Normandy, black soldiers ate in separate mess halls and slept in separate quarters. Back in the United States, they were barred from voting in many states, subjected to Jim Crow laws, and faced the constant threat of racial violence. The military itself was a paradox. It demanded equal sacrifice while enforcing inequality. This was the complication at the heart of the black soldiers' experience in World War II, a reality often referred to as the Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. For the men of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, this was not an abstract concept. It was their daily existence. On Omaha Beach, this contradiction was thrown into its starkest relief. The German defenders on the bluffs did not discriminate. Their machine guns and mortars killed black and white soldiers with equal impartiality. In the crucible of combat, the arbitrary lines of segregation became absurd. When a man was bleeding out on the sand, he did not care about the race of the medic trying to save him. Woodson's aid station was a small, temporary zone of integration, born of necessity and desperation. The white soldiers of the 1st and 29th Divisions, many from parts of America where racial mixing was taboo or illegal, owed their lives to the skill and courage of a black man from Philadelphia. Woodson's medical knowledge, cultivated at a historically black university, was now being used to save the lives of the sons of the dominant white society. He was, in effect, mending the very army that held him and his peers in contempt. This dynamic was not lost on the men of the 320th. They knew they had something to prove. Their performance under fire was being watched, judged not just by the standards of combat effectiveness, but through the warped lens of racial prejudice. They had to be better, braver, more disciplined, just to be considered equal. One of their fellow soldiers, a corporal named William Dabney, would later receive a Legion of Honor from France for his actions that day, helping pull men from the water under heavy fire. The men of the 320th performed their primary duty with distinction, getting their balloons aloft by the end of D-Day to protect the growing lodgment from air attack. But it was Woodson's singular, sustained act of medical service that stood as the most powerful testament. He was not just fulfilling his duty, he was embodying an ideal of service that transcended the ugly realities of segregation, proving that courage, skill, and compassion were not properties of any one race. The climax of Waverly Woodson's ordeal was not a single dramatic act of violence, but a quiet moment of total human exhaustion. After 30 consecutive hours of work, he finally collapsed. The physical toll had become insurmountable. He had lost a significant amount of his own blood. He was suffering from shock and extreme fatigue. The pain from his wounds, which he had ignored for a day and a half, overwhelmed him. Throughout his heroic marathon, he had treated, by conservative estimates, more than 200 wounded soldiers. He had set bones, sutured wounds, administered hundreds of doses of morphine, and distributed dozens of units of plasma. He had been a one-man bulwark against death, a fixed point of compassion in a universe of violence. His collapse was not a failure, but the final, inevitable outcome of a body pushed far beyond its physical limits. By the morning of June 7th, the situation on Omaha Beach had stabilized. The tenuous toehold of D-Day had become a secure, if still dangerous, beachhead. The dead were being collected, and organized casualty clearing stations had been established further up the beach, replacing the desperate, improvised aid stations of the first day. The relentless waves of wounded had finally begun to subside. Medics and doctors who had landed with later waves took over. Woodson was found where he had fallen, near the rock outcropping that had served as his surgery for 30 hours. He was finally a patient himself. He was triaged, his own wounds were properly dressed, and he was evacuated to a hospital ship offshore. The man who had saved so many was now in need of saving. His body had given out, but his will remained unbroken. After just 3 days of treatment and recovery aboard the ship, Waverly Woodson requested to be returned to his unit. His request was granted, and he rejoined the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion in Normandy as they continued their mission, moving inland with the advancing Allied armies. His incredible endurance and selfless service had not gone unnoticed. His commanding officer, so impressed by Woodson's actions, submitted a recommendation that he be awarded the nation's highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor. The recommendation cited his bravery under fire and the sheer number of lives he had saved while wounded himself. It was a clear-cut case of valor above and beyond the call of duty. The paperwork was sent up the chain of command, into the vast bureaucracy of the U.S. Army at war, and there it vanished. The official outcome of Woodson's 30 hours in hell was a Bronze Star, the nation's 4th highest award for bravery, and a Purple Heart for the wounds he sustained. These were significant honors, but they fell far short of what his actions warranted. The Medal of Honor recommendation was officially recorded as having been lost. In the context of the time, this was not a simple administrative error. It was a symptom of a deeply ingrained institutional racism. In all of World War II, during which more than 16 million Americans served and 473 medals of honor were awarded, not a single one was given to an African-American soldier. The military command structure, from the company level to the War Department in Washington, was simply unwilling to bestow the ultimate recognition of American heroism upon a black man. The recommendation from Woodson's commanding officer was a powerful statement, but it ran headlong into a wall of prejudice. For decades, Woodson's story, like those of many other black heroes of the war, remained largely unknown, a footnote in the grand narrative of D-Day. He returned from the war, married his wife, Joanne, and built a long and distinguished career. He became a supervisor in the clinical pathology department at the National Institutes of Health in Maryland, continuing the medical work he had begun in college. He rarely spoke of his time on Omaha Beach. The Bronze Star and the Purple Heart were tucked away, quiet mementos of a past he had moved on from. The true measure of his actions on June 6th and 7th was not in the medals he did or did not receive, but in the 200 men who went home to their families because he had refused to give up. The near-term ripple effect was a lost recommendation and a hero's quiet return to civilian life, but the long-term effect was a legacy of courage that would eventually force a nation to confront its own history. The story of Waverly Woodson is ultimately a story of proof. It demonstrates how the material reality of competence and courage can overwhelm the flimsy, poisonous mythologies of racism. For 30 hours on Omaha Beach, the abstract theories of racial inferiority that underpinned segregation collided with the concrete fact of Woodson's life-saving skill. In that crucible, only the skill mattered. His heroism was not ideological, it was practical, physical, and undeniable. His tools were not a rifle and bayonet, but sulfur, plasma, and an unshakable knowledge of human anatomy. He proved that the content of a man's character and the quality of his training were the true measures of his worth, not the color of his skin. His actions were a living refutation of the system that sought to diminish him. Decades after the war, the historical record began to be corrected. In 1993, a study commissioned by the U.S. Army and conducted by Shaw University, a historically black institution, investigated the reasons why no black soldiers had received the Medal of Honor in World War II. The study concluded that a climate of pervasive racism was to blame and identified several soldiers whose cases deserved review. While Waverly Woodson was not among the initial 7 men whose awards were upgraded to the Medal of Honor by President Bill Clinton in 1997, his case was later championed by his family, historians, and members of Congress. His lost recommendation was rediscovered in military archives, providing documented proof of his commander's original intent. The fight to see his Bronze Star upgraded to the Medal of Honor continues to this day, a posthumous struggle for the recognition he was denied in his lifetime. Woodson's story proves that history is not just a record of battles won and lost, but a struggle over memory and acknowledgement. The material facts of his service, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the LCT hit by an 88 shell, the 30 hours of continuous work, the 200 lives saved, the shrapnel wound he carried for the rest of his life, were nearly erased by the ideology of segregation. Yet they endured. The survival of his story is a testament to the idea that logistics, training, and individual human endurance are the true engines of history. Waverly Woodson, the unarmed black medic on Omaha Beach, demonstrated a truth more powerful than any weapon. In the final calculus of human conflict, the will to save is an act of defiance as profound as the will to fight, and a force that can, in the end, bend the arc of history toward justice.